Hello and welcome to the Kevin Mannix Report. I'm Kevin Mannix, the host for this program, which is designed to give all of us a little more information and insight into people who are involved in government issues and people who serve our community in a variety of ways. We often have one guest on the show, but today we have two guests. These are two gentlemen who are involved with Oregon gun owners, and we have one gentleman who is the administrator, the other gentleman is the executive director. The administrator is John Hellen. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Kevin.
And our executive director of Oregon gun owners, John Nichols. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Kevin.
What we try to do on this program is get a little background information at the outset about the individuals who are involved in government and community affairs. So I'll poke and pry a little bit with each of you about your backgrounds without being too pushy. And John Hellen, why don't you tell us a little bit about where you've come from and where you went to school, that sort of thing.
Well, I'm originally from Montana, actually, and came to school out here at Willamette University and graduated from Willamette. But I came out here because I have a lot of family that moved out here back in the 70s. So I have a lot of family still in Montana, but I do have about 7 aunts and uncles that live out here. My mom came from a very large family.
So you have the big sky country connection, but you also have the big Green Valley connection.
That's right, and the ocean being very close. That was a big deal to me. Once I graduated from Willamette, I went out to Washington, D.C. and worked for a Montana senator out there, and that pretty much started my interest in politics.
How long did you work in Washington, D.C.?
Actually, it was pretty brief. I was only there for about 7 months before they transferred me back home to Montana to work on the senator's re-election campaign.
And when did you end up based in the Salem area?
Well, I moved back here in February of '97 and went to work for Speaker Lundquist at the State House of Representatives and worked there through the end of session, and then came on board with Oregon Gun Owners.
Now, you're the administrator for Oregon Gun Owners. Can you give us a quick idea what that job's about? Then I'll talk to John Nichols here for a moment.
Sure. The administrative job is essentially just running the day-to-day activities of our organization, fundraising and balancing books and paying bills and trying to recruit more associates into the association and build a larger group of Oregonians that are concerned and active in protecting the Second Amendment. And I will be in charge of doing all the lobbying for this next session come in January. So it's prepping for the session, doing session wrap-up afterwards, making sure that we're on top of all the activities that are happening in Oregon that concern gun rights and potentially infringing on gun rights.
All right, so we started off with the younger gentleman whose job is to carry the workload, and then we turn to the paterfamilias, the gentleman who got this all going, John Nichols. Where do you hearken from, John?
I was born in Corvallis, Oregon. My fifth-generation Oregonian. My family on both sides settled in eastern Oregon. On my mother's side, they came across the plains in 1843. I went to school in Portland, worked for the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office for a while. I got involved in gun politics in about 1975 as a volunteer, and it just gradually turned into an occupation. I've been the chief lobbyist, well, ever since then, until we hired John. Basically, my function now is overseeing John and fundraising and writing articles and so on. I'm going to do a little bit of lobbying next session.
Now, you were really one of the key founders of Oregon Gun Owners. Can you tell us a little bit about the establishment of this organization?
Well, it began in about 1975 with a group of about 6 of us going down to oppose one of the Tuck Wilson specials that serve us from time to time that would have put in California-style gun control in Oregon. And the legislators said, "Aren't you guys organized?" Some of them said, "Don't you have a PAC?" So we started a PAC, and then
Political Action Committee.
Political Action Committee. And then a couple of years later, we organized Oregon Gun Owners as a lobbying group, and it's just kind of grown since then, making it up as we go along.
Now, Oregon Gun Owners seems to focus on what I'll call the government side of the equation. There are other organizations that may be involved in organizing actual shooting events and that sort of thing. There are gun clubs in different communities. There's also the National Rifle Association, which, while it has an advocacy arm, is also a training and organizing organization, a safety organization. Is it fair to say Oregon Gun Owners focuses on the public policy side of firearms?
That's correct. The organization that does most of the shooting matches and is the sanctioning body for shooting matches is the Oregon.
Is that the State Shooters Association?
Yeah, Oregon State Shooting Association. And the NRA has its Eddie the Eagle program, and they do some advocacy work in the legislature, but not a lot.
Now, over the years, and I'll be asking a little more about day-to-day as we go along here in terms of how lobbying works and all of that, but over the years, have you seen any kind of change in the climate as to how firearms are approached in Oregon in the last 20, 25 years?
Yeah, well, I've seen in my lifetime a big change. When I grew up in the 40s and 50s, everybody had a gun, nobody got upset. When I went to high school at Roosevelt High in Portland, we felt deprived because we were one of 2 high schools in the city that didn't have an indoor shooting range. But we'd take our rifles to school every Thursday afternoon, and after class we'd have a session of sight picture and position and trigger pull and whatever in a room that the school furnished for us. We'd pull the bolts out of our rifles before we got there, stack them in the vice principal's office, and pick them up after school. Nobody got upset. If we went to if we couldn't carpool with somebody and went to a shooting match at another high school, we'd ride Rose City Transit carrying our guns. And the generational change is mind-boggling. These days, if it did any of that, we'd wind up getting arrested. I see lately a change back toward realizing that guns are not the problem. It's a societal problem of no sanction for committing a crime and breakdown of the family and the whole social situation, but it's slow.
Now, I want to ask you one more personal question, then I'm going to ask John Hellen about his married life, but can you tell us about your family life?
I've been married for 30 years to Dot Nichols, who's a nurse educator. We have no children and 5 cats.
All right.
Or is it 5 cats and no children?
All right, John Hellen, you were recently married. You want to brag about that?
Coming up on 6 weeks tomorrow, actually. It's actually an interesting story. One of the reasons I did move back out to Oregon was to eventually be with my fiancée, now wife. We had been dating since our sophomore year in college back in 1990, so we had gone through a lot with my being in D.C. and being in Montana, and then I decided it was time to move out here and figure out if it was time to get married, and it ended up being definitely the right time to get married. So we got married in the end of September, and it's been wonderful.
Now, you've been chomping at the bit as I've been asking, or I could just hear you ready to jump in and help out with some things and add some more color to our discussion here as I was talking with John Nichols. I'm curious about your perspective as to what John Nichols was just talking about. Wouldn't it be good to help educate Oregonians about what it was like in the good old days, and you didn't have to worry about that kid on the bus with the rifle because you knew he was just going to school to practice shooting? You want to talk about that a little?
Well, one of the things that we are also concentrating on and are in the process of building a very substantial aspect of our organization, not only just the political activism side at the state capitol, but we have an education foundation that we think is going to be the future of what helps safeguard gun rights in Oregon by taking a very proactive step in the direction of teaching not only children, but also adults. You know, there are a lot of adults out there that don't properly know how to handle a firearm, and they just have come across one and think that it might be a good idea to protect their family, but perhaps they need some definite education in the proper use and storage and cleaning of firearms and teaching their children about firearms.
One of the misconceptions about gun control issues seems to be that people talk about guns as only being used for hunting, and well, for hunting then you only need a rifle or a shotgun. Why do you want to respond a little bit to that perception?
Sure, and part of the gun control myth out there also is that guns are only designed for one thing, which is to kill. Well, that's certainly not true. Guns provide lots of safety for families. There are untold millions, the estimates are, millions of people in this country who have protected themselves at one point or another in their lifetime with a firearm in their household. And those things don't go reported. You know, we don't find the police or the law enforcement agency taking that down as an actual point at where they have successfully defended their household, their lives with a firearm. In fact, there's a website out there, it's a link off of our website, that asks people to log in their stories or their accounts of an activity of when they've had to defend themselves with a firearm, and that what's called the gun defense clock, and it's showing over millions of people who have hit that website to say, hey, you know, I have successfully defended myself with a firearm, and I'm grateful for having had the opportunity.
You know, that raises the point, because it won't make the news if merely letting someone know that you're armed or showing the arm causes the crime not to occur. No newsworthy event has occurred, and the reason what you just said perked me up is I happened to be on the phone 3 days ago with a constituent, an 80-year-old gentleman who called me, and they call me with constituent concerns, and he mentioned that he was worried about traveling from state to state anymore. He has a concealed handgun permit in Oregon, and he's comfortable with that, but he was worried about reciprocity with other states, and he related how once on Interstate 5 he pulled into a rest stop late at night while traveling a few years ago, and there was no one else around at first, but then 3 punks, as he called them, thugs, approached his car. His doors were locked. They all came up to the windows and were acting in a very menacing fashion, as though they were going to break into his car or grab him. And then he simply pulled out his handgun and flashed it, in effect, and the 3 took off running. Of course, there was no police report and there was no crime, but there was a crime that was prevented from the circumstances as he described them, and he felt happy that he'd had that opportunity to protect himself. So apparently this happens, and this happens, and this happens, and it's just not documented.
That's right.
The same thing happened to me, sort of. I was home one day when I'd gone back, after I'd left law enforcement and gone back to college to work on my master's degree, and middle of the day, a young thug was sneaking around the back of the house and started to try to break in the back door. And he saw me, and he continued to try to break in. He had a bar, and I grabbed the gun and the phone, and he saw the gun and he took off. And I made a report of it, but it did not go down as a self-defense situation. It went down as an attempted burglary.
Well, when we have this kind of situation, you've mentioned then safety and security of individuals, a lot of folks don't seem to understand that the right to keep and bear arms came out of the American Revolution, and the capability of citizens to take up arms against the duly constituted authority, which was the king's troops. And yes, it was done through the militias, which were organized locally, but those militias were raising up against a higher, supposedly higher constituted authority, the king's troops, or whatever troops the king chose to hire, such as the Hessians, who were Germans, but were really mercenaries. They were hired to be professional troops in the colonies. How do we go about letting folks know that the right to keep and bear arms is more than hunting or even personal security, but it's also the right of citizens in this society, if need be, maybe, probably never in our lifetimes or in the foreseeable future, but if need be someday, to overthrow a tyrannical government, a dictatorship which no longer reflects the will of the people? Do we sound radical when we talk about it that way?
Well, that's a good question. I did my master's thesis in the background of the Second Amendment, and the American revolutionaries relied a lot on Roman history, works of Tacitus, where he talked about the Germans, and that if you weren't armed, you didn't have a right to vote, and voting was done at mass meetings, and they clanged their swords against their shields. And early Roman, before Rome became an empire and had a professional army, all citizens had to serve in the militia and the Roman army, and they conquered most of the known world. The cause of the English Civil War in 1642 was when the Crown started substituting a professional army and started trying to confiscate the arms of the militia. Same thing resulted in the Revolution of 1688, which was relatively peaceful. James II fled the country rather than fight. The early colonial laws required all persons to be armed. Youth above the age of 12 were required to be trained in arms. The widows, all citizens were required to serve in the watch and ward, which was the law enforcement aspect. The only law enforcement officer was the sheriff, who was elected. Actually, he's usually appointed in Crown colonies, but in places like Connecticut, he was elected. It wasn't until the 1830s that we really had a large army and a professional law enforcement.
In fact, in American history, there was a long-term fear of a standing army, for fear that there would be, in effect, a professional force which could subjugate society. Now, we've been fortunate in our civilized evolution as a society and a democracy to have maintained civilian control over the military, and we have that very strong tradition now inculcated within our society. But some folks may forget that there was a long-term legitimate fear of the power that a standing army could have, and if they don't think it can happen, take a look at Latin America, which now largely has elected democracies, but for 30 years went through a succession of military dictatorships where it was one junta after another coming in and saying, we don't care what the people voted for, we're here to restore order. John, you were going to say something about
well,
that.
Just, you know, I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist or anything, but when you start looking at the way that all the countries that make up the United Nations are starting to move more toward making decisions that affect all countries so that all people are more equal and fair, which is a noble goal, then you start to see where decisions that we used to make at the local, state, and even at the congressional level are now being handed off by executive fiat to another agency that we don't have as much control over as we do at a localized. You know, we've always emphasized in our country local control, and in fact that was, you know, the 10th Amendment revolution that happened, you know, what, 8 or 10 years ago, that started to emphasize let's give control back to the states. That's just one example of how we need to be concentrating more on letting ourselves take care of ourselves at a more localized level. And like I said, I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist, but it's not a jump in logic to recognize that when you start to hand off your power and your sovereignty to another level up above, then it isn't hard to see that something can happen that we don't expect. You know, it can just happen like that.
And the framers...
Let me interrupt you for a moment just so that I can mention to our audience that you're with us on the Kevin Mannix Report. Our guests today are two gentlemen named John. John Hellen, who is the Administrator for Oregon Gun Owners, and John Nichols, who is the Executive Director of Oregon Gun Owners. If at any time you have any questions or concerns, or even complaints for that matter, you can write to me at the Kevin Mannix Report, 2003 State Street, Salem, Oregon, 97301. You can also call me at our number, which is a Salem call, or outside the Salem area be a toll call at 503-391-8031. You might get a recorded message. Feel free to leave a message for us, a recording for us, and we'll get back to you. Now, turning back to our guests, John Nichols, you were about to jump in.
The framers viewed the carrying or the possession of weapons and the enrollment in the militia and the watch and ward as a civic duty. Many of the early statutes regarding voting said you either had to own X amount of property or serve in the militia, and they viewed it as a check on tyranny rather than the ability. Well, they didn't view it as the ability to rebel, but they felt if the public was well armed, that then they would never have to, because the government obviously wouldn't be able to put together enough troops to do anything about it. The Federalist Papers, both Hamilton and Madison, go into that quite extensively.
Well, now in Oregon today, we do have a number of firearms control laws. There was a massive rewrite of the laws in 1989. I participated in that as a freshman legislator in Salem, and as part of that process, we cleaned up some provisions that really didn't seem to be all that smart, and we put in some protections on both sides of the ledger, and it was a package of legislation where all parties came to the table. And for example, it's incredible but true that until 1989, felons could still possess certain kinds of firearms. firearms. And the theory originally was, I'm told, that, well, after you've been released from prison and you need to go to the backcountry, you still need to hunt in order to live or to defend the back 40 acres or whatever, so you needed to have a firearm. Well, we realize in modern days, felons, first of all, that's a serious crime, and we just said for 15 years after conviction, after release, you can't possess a firearm. And that's just too bad. You can't go hunting anymore. We also included violent misdemeanors and persons who were found mentally ill and dangerous. Obviously, there are many people with mental illness who are not dangerous, but those who've been determined to be dangerous were also excluded from possessing a firearm. We also put restrictions on access to firearms for juveniles. That system seems to be working. The balance on the other side of the ledger was that an honest citizen with a clean record could get a concealed handgun permit to be able to carry a concealed handgun in a number of circumstances. Now, we've heard all kinds of horror stories about the idea, wow, all these armed citizens going around. John Hellen, do you want to talk about concealed handgun permits and the terrible things that have happened as a result, supposedly?
Well, yeah, the terrible things that have happened in Florida, as an example, in a study done by the University of Chicago professor John Lott, showed that after concealed handgun licenses were instilled in Florida, violent crime dropped significantly. And we're talking some major drops, as much as 40 to 50% within the first few years of the law being enacted. So what we're finding, and what he found across the country, because now some 30 states do have concealed handgun licenses, that violent crime across the country, in those states that have adopted concealed handguns licenses, has dropped significantly. So you'll hear the gun control advocates argue that the more armed a society is, the more dangerous we are, but in fact the exact opposite has proven to be true. And the professor's studies have been examined by other outside groups who have validated his statistics and his findings.
Now, what's interesting about this is actually, in Oregon, for example, you could carry a handgun visibly in many circumstances, but if you hid it, the idea was, in the old days, the idea was this person must have evil intent because he's hiding his firearm as opposed to the person who displayed it. But in modern society, since we're not so much used to seeing firearms publicly displayed other than by, say, police officers, people might get a little nervous seeing someone walking around with a .45 strapped to his thigh. So a lot of people are more interested in discreet carry it in your pocket or whatever. So one wonders about folks freaking out about these folks now having to take a course showing that they know how to handle a firearm, that they understand the laws involving firearms, and demonstrate that they have a clean record, and then get a permit so they can carry concealed that which they previously could carry publicly. Have we had a number of crimes committed by people who made use of these concealed handgun permits?
No, we have been able to document we've been unable to document any crimes committed by people with concealed handgun licenses. There have been some people had their licenses revoked, but it's for dumb activities like going into a restaurant, taking off their coat and sitting at the counter with their gun on their hip, just kind of lack of common sense type of thing, or when the situation isn't really threatening, pulling it out and brandishing it, that type of thing. To the best of my knowledge, there's only been 2 cases where a concealed handgun license person has used it to shoot somebody, and in both those cases, the grand juries decided that they were justifiable. One was a woman in North Portland who drove into her garage, and there was somebody in there burglarizing the house who then threatened her, and the other was a black gentleman out in Gresham who was attacked by some people with a tire iron. So there's not been blood in the streets as was predicted when the bill passed.
As part of that whole equation, I assume there have been a lot of instances where a person who carried a concealed handgun was able then to brandish it and scare off perpetrators.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and those usually don't get reported because the sheriff might make the determination that, hey, why'd you pull it? You weren't, 20/20 hindsight, the guy would probably have left, so I'm going to pull your gun for brandishing. So, as you referred to the gentleman who was in the rest stop, I doubt he reported that because he might have gotten in trouble with the law for having defended himself.
Well, what are some of the issues that are coming down for the next legislative session in regard to firearms?
Well, we have already heard the gun control side. Oregonians Against Gun Violence is the main organization based here in Oregon for Handgun Control Incorporated out of Washington, D.C. And they're looking at bills such as trigger locks, mandatory trigger locks being on the sale, transfer, and use of all weapons, of all firearms. We're looking at guns that, or laws that would make it a felony for people who had allowed unsupervised access to a juvenile for firearms. We're looking at, and keep in mind that that sort of a law could be as simple of a situation as in standing in the backyard with your child, showing them how to clean the weapon, unloaded, no ammunition in sight, showing them how to clean it. You get a telephone call, you go inside, you have a neighbor who's anti-gun, sees a child in the backyard cleaning the firearm, calls the police, and turns you in for unsupervised access to a firearm. It could be absolutely that simple, and to us that's just a wholly egregious
Well, what about the idea of gun safety and preventing these tragedies that we read about as some kid playing with a gun that he thinks is unloaded? What would your response be to how we ought to handle that situation?
Well, you need early education. As I referred earlier to my own upbringing, there were guns around. Everybody knew what a gun was. It's possibly because most people at that time were either born on a farm or were first generation off a farm. But I can remember in the 3rd grade when we had show and tell. I was right toward the end of the war, about 1945, and every once in a while some kid would bring in a Nambu or Luger that his father had brought or sent home from the war, and our teacher would gingerly get it and call the shop teacher, who was a Marine who lost his leg, to come up and make sure it was unloaded, and then they play show and tell. It's lack of familiarity with firearms causes a problem. In Linwood, Colorado, and I guess it's been replicated elsewhere, they did a study or did a demonstration about a year ago where they took two groups of young children. One group had been exposed to the NRA's Eddie the Eagle program, which says if you find a gun, don't touch it, call an adult. And they took another group that had never been exposed to firearms, and they put them in rooms. The group that was put in with a firearm hidden, and the group that was put in the room with the firearm that had Eddie the Eagle, when the gun was discovered, was, don't touch it. Somebody's standing over it, don't, and go to find an adult to turn it into. And inevitably, the group of kids that did not have any kind of firearms education would treat it as another toy which was in the room and immediately pointed at somebody and pulled the trigger. There have been a couple of studies, one here in the United States and one in Australia, that says that when children are exposed to firearms by a responsible adult, they are A, less likely to become criminals, and B, if they do become criminals, they don't use firearms in their crimes, because firearms are a tool, not a weapon of the bad guy.
I still remember as a child my dad introducing us to his handguns and immediately showing us the safe handling before we did anything else, and always assuming the gun is loaded. You never point it at anyone. You never point it where you don't, if it's loaded, certainly you don't point it unless you're prepared to shoot. I'm not going to give a firearm safety talk right now, but the whole point was you learned the safe handling of firearms. Well, we only have about 30 seconds left, so I anticipate that we'll see some heavy lobbying by you, John Hellen, next session.
Yes.
And hopefully by me too.
And John Nichols will come around and visit the legislators.
If the boss will let me do it.
And we'll try to have some good, frank discussion about how we can reduce handgun problems in our society, but also maintain the right to keep and bear arms.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you both for joining us on the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you to our audience for joining us. We'll see you next time on the Kevin Mannix Report.